Hello friends, time to get our frame built for the Maslow CNC, the newest edition, 2019. So most people would choose the default frame. We accidentally chose Bar's bolt together frame. We were going to the store and started getting materials for the wrong one, and by the time we got it all, it was too late. So I recommend doing the default frame. Bolt frame's not bad either though. So following the assembly guide, you want to cut all your pieces ahead of time, get them all laid out, everything you need in one place. It's a good idea to print off the instructions. We also labeled all the pieces of wood, A, B, and C, based on what size they were. It made it a little bit easier to distinguish which piece goes where. Really, it's just about getting that ball rolling. Once you get things figured out, what piece goes where and how things are arranged, you really start moving pretty quick. But as you can see, the first part here is a little tricky just getting started. Word of advice though, make sure both A-frames are identical before you attach your plywood. We made the mistake of having one piece just off a little bit. So again, it's the Bar's bolt design. So there's a bunch of bolts here that we got from the hardware store, and you just have to feed them through the holes that we drilled and secure everything together. The Bar bolt design is really simple. There's not a lot of material. It's a lot less wood than the default frame. So it's a little bit cheaper, I guess, in cost. But again, we accidentally chose the bolt design. I would probably recommend using the default frame. It's if you're doing it by yourself, I think the default frame would be a lot easier by yourself. As we'll see here in a little bit, the bolt together frame, you need two people to do it. So you feed those bolts through, put the nut on, tighten them up. You're going to do the exact same thing twice. You're basically building two A-frames. And you're going to set your waste board, your piece of 4x8 foot plywood, on these two A-frames. And the plywood holds the whole thing together. And then you put a 2x4 across the front of it on the top, which is going to hold your motors and your chain and your bungee cords to keep the chains organized. In your box here, you've got a bunch of bags. They're labeled 1 through I think 9, but they don't tell you what it's for anywhere. Not in the instructions, not on the assembly guide on the website. It doesn't tell you. So you kind of just have to figure it out as you go. Now at this point, we did not get a video of us putting the frame together, unfortunately, because it took two people to do it. But as you can see, we've got the motors already attached. It's very simple to attach the motors. You just find the bag with the screws with the motor brackets and you attach it. Pretty simple. So on the back of the waste board, you're going to attach the Arduino. And this is kind of a weird setup. You're just screwing it to the back of this waste board. There's nothing to protect it from something hitting it from behind, or if you screw up on your waste board and you cut something too deep, it could cut right through the Arduino. So I highly recommend building something to house it and to make it more secure. You're going to want to label your halfway point on the 2x4 that holds the motors, and then you just basically want to follow the instructions on the assembly guide for that header piece at the top. It'll tell you where to put screws to help you keep the chains organized. It's pretty simple. Now again, the Bar bolt design is contingent on that 4x8 piece of plywood holding everything together. So as you can see, we've got the motors on, the chains run, and the bungee cords to keep tension on the chains to keep it so there's not too much slack. It's kind of a trial and error process. You just kind of have to play with it and get it to where you want it to stay. It just takes a little bit of trial and error. Pretty easy though. Now moving on to your sled, we chose to use the rigid router R22002. That's what's recommended by Maslow. There's other routers that you can use, but we went with the one that was the recommended one. Just take a piece of scrap plywood, doesn't really matter the size or dimensions exactly, but you're going to want to cut a hole in the center of it. This is just the temporary sled that you're going to use, so it doesn't have to be perfect. So you're going to want to remove the plastic housing on the rigid router. There's just 3 screws to take out. And then once you have your temporary sled down, you're going to want to get ready to attach the bricks. And you have these pieces of plywood with bolts to secure it in place. It's a good idea to keep them symmetrical so the weight's evenly distributed on the sled. So it's a good idea to lay out everything ahead of time to make sure everything fits and you're putting it in the correct place. That's why you see we put the brick down, just to make sure everything's lining up the way that it should. Again, temporary sled, doesn't matter. You're going to toss this thing away down the road after you build your final sled. That should be one of the first projects you do with the Maslow is cutting out your final sled. It's a good idea though, even with the temporary sled, to countersink the screws. This is the side that's going to be laying against the plywood that you're going to be cutting, so you don't want anything sticking out past that, cutting grooves or making indentions on the plywood that you're going to be cutting. So it's a good idea to make sure everything's recessed into that sled. When you're putting the bricks in place, make sure they're nice and tight. You don't want that brick to slide off in the middle of when you're cutting something. That's going to screw up your project that you're working on. So it's always a good idea to lay everything out first, make sure everything is the way that it's supposed to before you secure it in place. A couple things we noticed when we were building the temporary sled, and you'll see in the next video when we put on the linkage. The screws that are provided are pretty small, but there's so many of them that it's pretty strong and it stays intact. But at first glance, I did not think that they were going to work. I thought we were going to have to get other screws, like beefier wood screws, to make this work. But the little screws they provide work just fine. Again, taking off those handles off the rigid router, if that's the one you choose to go with, is not an easy task. You're basically gonna destroy the handles taking them off, but you'll never need them if you're going to be using them solely for the Maslow. So that's all we intended to use it for, so we ripped them right off. The next video we're going to talk about attaching the linkage and putting it onto the frame. Then it's time to calibrate, which is by far the most difficult part of this whole process. I'll go into it in depth on the next video. Hit subscribe and like the video if you enjoyed it. There'll be more videos coming up. Thanks.